Subscribe please, thank you, bye. This case takes place in Malaysia in 2017. Zulfaran was a 21-year-old man who was born and raised in Johor Bahru, Malaysia. He was the eldest of 4 siblings. He grew up in a close-knit, working-class Muslim family. Friends and family described him as soft-spoken, respectful, and disciplined. His father would later say that he was a young man with a deep sense of responsibility, especially toward his younger siblings. From an early age, Zulfaran showed a strong interest in serving his country, particularly the Malaysian Navy. His dream was to become a naval officer, and this shaped his entire life. He excelled at school and caused absolutely no trouble according to his teachers. His father described him as a bright and obedient boy who never gave anyone any trouble, and his mother said that he was the pride of the family. So it's not surprising that he was accepted into Malaysia's National Defence University at the age of 18 in 2014. This marked a major milestone for him and his entire family, who had sacrificed a lot for him to achieve his dreams. He enrolled and was doing incredibly well. He was on track to becoming a commissioned officer in the Royal Malaysian Navy. According to his family, Zulfaran was incredibly proud to wear his uniform, and would often call his family while dressed in full military gear, saluting his parents and showing off the routines he was learning. He was especially close to his mother, who he would call daily, sometimes just to say, "I love you." By 2017, Zulfaran was in his 3rd year at the National Defence University, with just 1 more year to go before he would graduate and become an officer. Things were going incredibly well for him, and his dream was nearly in reach. But this all changed. All because of something so incredibly trivial, a missing laptop. In May of 2017, one of Zulfaran's friends and dorm mates at the university, named Mohammed Akmal, discovered that his laptop was missing. Mohammed Akmal began to believe that Zulfaran had stolen it, and so he questioned him about the whereabouts of this device. But Zulfaran denied taking the laptop. He swore up and down that he did no such thing, but he could see that Mohammed Akmal didn't believe him. The truth of the matter was that he had not taken the laptop, but Akmal refused to believe this. Now, the correct thing to do at this point would of course be to contact the authorities, who would be able to investigate the matter and civilly come to a conclusion as to the whereabouts of the laptop. But this wasn't what happened. Not even close. Instead, Akmal took matters into his own hands. He consulted a bomo, which is a traditional healer or shaman, in desperation to find the culprit. The bowman he approached was the father of one of their fellow cadets, and was a cadet who would later become involved in what was to come. The bomo performed a series of prayers which are designed to produce a vision of the truth. Following these prayers, he claimed to have a vision identifying Zulfaran as the thief. He was completely wrong. Yet this supernatural accusation further inflamed Akmal's suspicion and his anger, so much so that he would become the instigator in one of Malaysia's most gruesome cases. By the night of the 21st of May 2017, tensions in the university dormitory had reached a serious and dangerous boiling point. A group of Zulfaran's fellow cadets, many of them Akmal's close friends, set about to interrogate him about the missing laptop and to force a confession. Akmal, along with 18 other students, confronted Zulfaran in a dorm, literally hell-bent on getting answers. Zulfaran was just minding his own business in his dorm room when the group of cadets proceeded to march into his room. They barged in, which, as you can imagine, startled him a great deal. Without saying much, Zulfaran was taken by force from his own room and physically apprehended. They then took him to room 0305. This was the room where the horrifying attack would later take place. He was taken to this room and was held captive by his own peers. At around midnight, he was grilled by the attackers. They were determined to know where the missing laptop was, but of course, Zulfaran had no idea. By 2:30 a.m. in the early hours of the 22nd of May, this interrogation escalated to outright torture. Zulfarin's hands and feet were tied up to the bed so he could not escape or fight back. The cadets then began to mercilessly beat him, shouting at him to confess and tell them where the device was. Of the 18 cadets, the group consisted of 6 primary torturers, and they were led by Akmal. These were Mohammed Madsofi, Mohammed Nijab Mod Razi, Mohammed Asad, Mohammed Sabri, and Abdul Mod Ali. They whipped him with a belt, hit him with a rubber hose, and struck him multiple times with a clothing hanger. All the while, Zulfarhan maintained his innocence. He cried out that he did not steal the laptop, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The torture only escalated when the beatings failed to produce the confession that they so desperately wanted. Because he wouldn't confess, the despicable gang grew ever more frustrated, and so they upped the depravity of their methods. They looked for something more extreme, something capable of delivering enough pain to force a confession out of him. A steam iron. What they did next is almost too painful to imagine. One of the cadets plugged the iron into the socket, turned on the appliance, and waited. Waited until the metal plate was scalding hot, hot enough that the skin would blister upon even touching it. Then, taking turns, they pressed the hot iron against Zulfarin's bare skin over and over and over again. They burned every area of his body except for his face and the top of his hands, which was deliberate. The group specifically avoided burning these areas so that if he wore a long-sleeve shirt, the torture marks would be hidden if they needed to transport him. From 4:45 a.m. for the next several hours, Zulfarin was tortured with the iron approximately 90 times. This included onto his chest, back, abdomen, ribcage, arms, shoulders, shoulder blades, thighs, calves, and ankles. They even burned the most sensitive areas, both sides of his buttocks and his privates, holding down the iron for prolonged periods of time on these specific areas. One of the torturers later admitted that when he pressed the iron into his inner thigh, Zulfarhan recoiled his leg and let out a cry of "please don't," but he just continued. Mohammed Akmal later confessed that he pressed the hot iron into the sole of Zulfarhan's foot. The burns were so severe that raw muscle tissue was exposed. This level of trauma to the skin can easily lead to death, even with medical treatment. Eventually, as the sun began to rise on the 22nd of May, the 6 finally stopped. Zulfarin was unable to stand or walk properly due to the pain. He had endured the unendurable, and throughout all of this, he never confessed to the crime that he didn't commit. As the morning came, realization set in. Not remorse, not at all. It was fear of punishment for what they had done. So with this, the group conspired to hide the crime and avoided alerting the authorities. Instead of taking Zulfarhan to the emergency room, they kept him hidden in the dorm for days, nursing him just enough to keep him alive and to deflect suspicion, all the while preventing him from accessing proper medical treatment. The fear and the pain that Zulfarhan must have felt in these days is hard to even comprehend. His absence was explained away by others who told their lecturers that he was attending to a family matter, but the truth was that he was lying in a dorm room with his body trying to fight off a fatal infection. The 6 attackers applied some basic dressings to his wounds, but they could see that his health was deteriorating, and it was happening incredibly fast. On the 27th of May 2017, 5 days after the attack, the gang realized that Zulfarhan was in need of medical attention that they could simply not provide him, and so they brought him into a small private clinic in Bandar Baru Bangi. This was miles away from the campus. 4 of the cadets took him to the clinic, but they lied to the doctor about what happened. They told the doctor on duty that his injuries were caused by an explosion during military training. It was a concocted story to avoid blame, and Zulfarhan was told to go along with it, or he would face punishment. Before the doctor even closely examined the wounds, he could tell that Zulfarhan was clearly in serious trouble. He was feverish and in extreme pain. The doctor strongly advised that Zulfahan be taken to a hospital immediately, but Zulfahan refused. This was because the attackers had told him that there would be repercussions if he tried to go. The doctor cleaned and bandaged up some of the wounds and urged the friends to take him to hospital as soon as possible. The 4 cadets said they would, but they lied, and they instead took Zulfahan back to the dormitory. Following this, 4 long and grueling days would pass. By the 31st of May, Zulfahan's condition had deteriorated even further. He was now clearly on the brink of death. This time, 2 of the cadets brought him back to the same clinic for the second time. The doctor who treated him the first time was utterly shocked that Zulfahan had not gone to the hospital as instructed. The doctor again dressed some of his wounds and told them to go to the hospital immediately, but it was already too late. The following day, on the 1st of June 2017, Zulfahan's terrible suffering came to an end. That evening, whilst being hidden in the dormitory, his body began to shut down. At approximately 10 p.m, Zulfahan went stiff, and one of the cadets finally called for an ambulance. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but Zulfahan was shortly pronounced dead not long after. He died 10 days after the initial torture began. 10 whole days. Upon arriving at the hospital, the staff were suspicious upon seeing his dead body. This was no ordinary death, and it certainly wasn't a training accident. His body had all the signs of torture. There were distinct burn marks, bruises, and extreme swelling. According to the autopsy, the fatal burns had caused widespread swelling and organ failure due to the severe trauma and infection. The injuries were so severe that even if he was brought in on the first day of the attack, he likely wouldn't have survived. Autopsy reports and the initial suspicion prompted a swift investigation. News spread, sending shockwaves around the country. The very same day that Zulfahan died, the police detained a large group of students as the investigation proceeded. Shortly after his tragic death, Zulfahan was laid to rest in his hometown. His parents, who had done everything to help him achieve his dreams, were now left to grapple with an unimaginable loss, and this loss was only compounded when they discovered just how he was killed. In the coming days, a total of 36 students from the university were detained. They were either suspected of involvement or that they might know something about the crime. Over the next 2 weeks, the police narrowed down the suspects who were involved. The 6 main culprits were arrested. These were the ones responsible for the torture, along with 12 others who were present or involved but to a lesser degree. The police were able to recover the physical evidence. The steam iron itself was recovered, and it matched to the pattern of burns on Zulfahan's body. Investigators also found the blood-stained belts and rubber hoses in the dormitory. Traces of blood were also found inside the dorm room. But not only this, charred skin that had fallen from Zulfahan's body was also found on the floor. On the 14th of June 2017, just 2 weeks after Zulfahan's death, charges were formally laid out in court. The 18 students were brought before the magistrate and charged. The 6 were singled out as the main perpetrators. They were charged with murder under Section 302 of the Penal Code, which carries the mandatory death penalty. The remaining other students were charged with lesser offences, such as assisting or failing to stop the torture. All 18 accused students pleaded not guilty to the charges. The main 6 gave varying and often conflicting statements during the investigation. Collectively, they attempted to minimise their roles, denied intent to kill, and framed the entire ordeal as a disciplinary action and an interrogation gone wrong. They claimed that none of them intended to actually kill him. However, the case was so extreme that laws were changed and bypassed to have the 18 tried in the High Court. The High Court agreed to hear all the charges together in one trial. This meant that the 18 students in total would stand trial concurrently, 6 for murder and the rest for assisting in the crime. The stage was now set for a landmark court case that would grip the nation for the next few years. The trial began on the 29th of January 2018 in the High Court. Over the course of the proceedings, the prosecution called 29 witnesses to testify to the harrowing events. These witnesses included forensic experts, the clinic doctor who treated Zulfahan, Zulfahan's roommates and friends, and even some of the accused's own peers who were present during the initial parts of the incident. Their testimony, combined with physical evidence, painted a horrific and detailed picture of the gruesome murder. The doctor who conducted the autopsy presented evidence of the 90 distinct burn marks on Zulfahan's body, with photographs showing the exposed muscle, stating that these injuries were literally head to toe except from the face and the back of the hands. The torturers took to the stand and made their defense. They all gave conflicting accounts, some admitting to some pieces of involvement and others outright denying it. However, Mohammed Akmal, who was the main instigator, testified. He said that he only carried on because Zulfahan didn't fight back. Most of the others tried to say that they were simply bystanders and pointed the finger at each other. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that all of the accused were attempting to shift blame. Despite these defenses, there was no getting around the fact that Zulfahan had been tied up, collectively tortured, and then deprived of medical help by this group. In court, the truth of Zulfahan's suffering came out in stark detail, so much so that Zulfahan's mother, who attended the trial daily, broke down in tears as she heard the descriptions of how her son was treated, hearing things that no mother should have to hear. The trial started in 2018, and after years of hearings and exhaustive testimony, the defense phase concluded in April of 2021. On the 2nd of November 2021, the judge delivered the verdict. The whole country waited in anticipation to hear the outcome. The judge found that the 6 main attackers were guilty, but not of murder. Instead, he convicted all 6 culpable of homicide amounting to murder, essentially a form of manslaughter, meaning that they caused Zulfahan's death without intent to kill. In the judge's view, the prosecution had proven that the 6 had injured Zulfahan with the knowledge that their acts were likely to cause death, but not that they had a premeditated intent to murder him. With this, all 6 were sentenced to 18 years in prison for the culpable homicide charge. Additionally, the court found 12 of the other students guilty of voluntarily causing harm to extort a confession, and handed them a lighter sentence of just 3 years imprisonment each. In explaining his decision, the judge said that there was no single injury identified as the sole cause of death. His death came from many injuries, and this lack of a pinpointed fatal blow introduced reasonable doubt about the murderer's intent, essentially ruling the case as a brutal form of hazing gone horribly wrong, rather than premeditated murder. Zulfahan's family were outraged. Not only did they lose their son, they had to go through a grueling trial, a trial which lasted years, only for the killers to get a relatively light sentence. They had to hear how their son was tied up and tortured, and then left to slowly die, and then they were let down by the courts. But it wasn't over yet. The prosecutors were rather unhappy with the verdict. They believed that the killers should be looking at much, much harsher punishments. So the very next day, they filed an appeal, seeking to overturn the culpable homicide verdict and reinstate the murder charges for all 6. They argued that the death was so gruesome and prolonged that intent to cause lethal harm should just be inferred. However, unfortunately for Zulfahan's family, they would have to wait 3 more years for the appeals to be heard. On the 23rd of June 2024, a 3-judge panel issued a 93-page document condemning the acts against Zulfahan as rare and extreme inhumane acts of violence. A new verdict was reached. It convicted the 6 men under the Penal Code 302, reinstating the original charge. The 6 were now sentenced to death by hanging, and the other 12, they were sentenced to 4 years instead of 3. The judge said, "This case is amongst the rarest of the rare, involving extreme cruelty that possesses a grave danger to society. The court will not tolerate such incidents." The judge then turned to the parents and said, No parent should feel disappointed by the courts upon receiving their beloved child's body in such a heart-wrenching condition. Upon hearing this, it's reported that the parents wept tears of gratitude in the courtroom. For them, justice was finally served. Outside the courtroom, Zulfahan's father thanked all of the Malaysians who had prayed for justice, but Zulfahan's mother just stood quietly by her husband's side. It's reported that they both looked like shells of their former selves. His mother would later say that she ran out of tears long ago. When the Court of Appeal sentenced the 6 men to death, they were reported to have cried out in court, but never had there been a direct apology to Zulfahan's parents during or after the sentencing. His father said, "None of them came forward to say sorry. None of them looked us in the eye and explained why they did what they did. Now only when death stares at them do they cry. I wish I could say that this is where the case ends, but sadly it doesn't." The 6 men exercised their final right of appeal to the federal court. For the family, the wait continued. The closure they thought they had was taken from them. The proceedings in the federal court took place in late 2024 into early 2025. Then, on the 28th of February 2025, the court delivered the final verdict. They revoked the previous verdict and upheld the first convictions of the 6 men for culpable homicide not accounting to murder. They agreed that intent to kill was not proven. The 18-year prison terms were reinstated for each of the 6 men. 8 long years had passed for Zulfahan's parents, and now they were right back where they started, and this time it was final. The killers never apologized for what they did. The case of Zulfahan had a rather significant impact on Malaysian society, especially regarding awareness to bullying. He became a symbol, and his story sparked an ongoing public discourse about bullying. Zulfahan's mother has since said that she forgives the 6 men. In an interview, she said that she prays they will repent and become better people, but she still struggles every single day to understand why they did what they did. She stated that forgiveness did not mean forgetfulness, and that this was for her own healing and not because the killers deserved it. Despite this very public forgiveness, to this day, the 6 men have never reached out to her and offered her an apology for what they did over the course of those 10 long days. Hi, I'm Insecure, so if you subscribe to me, it'll make me feel better. Thank you. This case takes place in the USA in the year 1979. July 17th, 1980, deep in the woods in Alaska, just near the Eklunta Lake, a crew of electricians were walking along a remote power line trail. Their job was routine, but what they found buried beneath a thin layer of dirt was anything but. A woman, no ID, no name, just red boots, handmade jewellery, and the marks of a violent end. This is the case of Eklunta Annie. In the late 1970s, Anchorage, Alaska was a boomtown with a dark underside. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline had recently been built, bringing an influx of workers and money into the city, which then created a rowdy nightlife. This drew the attention of some young women who were seeking jobs as topless dancers or street workers, and tragically, this attracted the attention of an absolute monster. Between 1979 and 1983, dozens of vulnerable women in Anchorage vanished or were found murdered in the wilderness. And it would be on the 17th of July 1980 that a crew of electricians working on a power line made a gruesome discovery. In a heavily wooded area about a mile south of the road, they found a shallow grave containing human remains of a young woman partially buried in the dirt. The scene was eerie and isolated. Only the hum of a nearby power line could be heard. The workers were of course shaken, but they wasted no time, and they immediately called law enforcement. Alaskan state troopers arrived to secure the scene and recovered the remains. The body was so decomposed that only the bones and a small amount of mummified tissue remained. It was clear that the victim had been dead for quite some time. Investigators noted that the grave was shallow and hastily dug, suggesting that someone had tried to hide the body in a rush. However, there was no form of identification, no purse, and no ID cards were found with her. The discovery understandably shocked local communities. Finding a murdered young woman in Anchorage's outskirts sparked fear and rumours. News outlets reported the basic facts. An unidentified female found near Eklunta. Without a name, the press could only describe her as Jane Doe, but she would soon be given the moniker Eklunta Annie. At the time of the discovery, the police had a homicide on their hands with no identity for the victim, and no immediate leads on the killer. The case, tragically, was cold from day one. Annie's remains were transported to the medical examiner's office in Anchorage for an autopsy and analysis. Forensic examination yielded critical details about her appearance, the time of her death, and how she was killed, though it stopped short of revealing her name. Experts concluded that Annie had been dead for approximately 1 year by the time she was found. This placed her death in late 1979, likely in the fall of 1979, given the warm clothing she was found wearing. The Alaskan wilderness with its cold winters may have slowed down the decomposition, but enough time had passed that only skeletal remains were found. This made identifying her much harder for the investigators. The autopsy determined that she had died from a single stab wound to the back, which penetrated her lungs and killed her. The forensic evidence indicated that she likely had been stabbed once between her shoulder blades, causing her lungs to collapse. Despite the advanced decomposition, experts could profile Annie's basic traits from her bones and her remaining hair. She was rather small, estimated at around 4'11" to 5'3", and she had a small build. And this is where it gets even more disturbing. It seems that she was likely in her late teens to early 20s. Some experts believe she was 16 and others 25. Her skull suggested that she was Caucasian with possible Native American ancestry, and she had strawberry blonde to light brown hair. She was found wearing some striking red boots, and she was wearing some distinctive jewellery. A handmade metal bracelet with 3 turquoise stones, a necklace made of shell beads, a ring carved from white shell, and gold twisted hoop earrings. These accessories were distinctive enough that police publicised photographs of them. They were sure that someone somewhere would recognise them, or recall a missing friend who would wear such items. But tragically, no one came forward. In her jacket pocket, investigators found a small box of matches, which indicated that she might have also been a smoker. With the body examined and the evidence catalogued, the police checked the missing person register for anyone who fit Annie's description, but it came up empty. No one matching this description had been reported missing in the time frame that she was killed. This only deepened the mystery of Eklunta Annie. It of course meant that her disappearance went unreported. A working theory for investigators was that she might have been a new arrival to Anchorage with few local ties, possibly fleeing an abusive home life or an abusive partner. For several years after 1980, Eklunta Annie's case languished without resolution. Her bones were buried in Anchorage's Memorial Park Cemetery under the placeholder marker Jane Doe, died 1980. The police had no name, no suspect. They were baffled as to how someone so young could have no one in their life who would have reported them missing to the police. Surely she should have some family or friends who knew she was missing. But tragically, clearly she didn't. But in 1983, a dramatic turn of events brought her case back into focus. That year, the serial killer behind the despicable string of deaths was caught, and he would eventually admit to killing the girl found near Eklunta Lake. In 1983, a killer was caught, Robert Hansen. In June of that year, a 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson escaped from Robert in Anchorage, and how she escaped was nothing short of incredible. Cindy Paulson was working the streets near downtown. She was the kind of girl who Robert Hansen hunted. But Cindy was different, as she would be the one to survive him, and she would end his reign of terror. She was young, tough, and street smart, but nothing could prepare her for the man who pulled up beside her that night. A quiet man with glasses who said his name was Bob offered her $200 for a quick job. This was more than usual. She hesitated, but then got into the car. What she didn't know was that Robert Hansen had already picked out her burial site. The moment the car doors locked, the tone changed. He pulled out a gun and drove her to a small, ordinary-looking house. His house. Once inside, he took her to the basement. That's where he chained her by the neck to a post in the center of the room. Hansen then tortured her and forced himself upon her. After doing this, he began to pack. He packed rope, a hunting knife, and a rifle. She asked him what he was doing, and he told her, "We're going flying. I've got a place I want to show you." By morning, he loaded her into his car. She was still handcuffed, still terrified. He drove her to a small airfield in the middle of Anchorage. Cindy watched as he began loading a small bush plane. She didn't know exactly where they were going, but she was sure of one thing. If she got on that plane, she would never come back. As Hansen bent over the cockpit, checking the gear and preparing for takeoff, Cindy bravely made her move. She ran. Barefoot and handcuffed, she ran across the tarmac and the gravel. She was able to get away. And as luck would have it, a man driving a pickup truck spotted her, screaming and waving. The man stopped, and he let her in. She begged this man not to take her to the police. She was scared that she would get into trouble for her lifestyle. So instead, he dropped her off at a nearby motel, the Mush Inn, where she called for her boyfriend. But the driver, he called the police. An officer then made his way to the motel. He found Cindy hiding under a blanket in one of the rooms. She was still in handcuffs and still shaking. She then told him everything. The chains in the basement, the knife, the airport, the plane. She even described Hansen's house, his car, even the interior. And it all checked out. Robert Hansen was then arrested. When the police brought him in for questioning, he denied everything. He said that Cindy was lying, and that she was trying to extort him because he refused to pay her. He appeared to be calm, and he appeared to be collected, and so he was free to go. However, eventually, her testimony, along with other evidence, finally cracked open the secret of who had been hunting women around Anchorage. On the 27th of October 1983, police arrested Robert Hansen on multiple charges. So, who was Robert? Robert was an experienced hunter who lived a double life. By day, he ran his bakery business, and by night, he became a predator. By all accounts, he wasn't the kind of man you'd cross the road to avoid. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't menacing. He ran a bakery, he was a father, and he was a quiet man who stuttered when he spoke. He had 2 children with his second wife, Darla Hansen. The family lived together in Anchorage during the years he committed these crimes. Darla was reportedly unaware of his double life. His wife and children were often away visiting relatives or out of state, which gave him the perfect opportunity to abduct and kill without them knowing. For over a decade, he hunted women through the Alaskan wilderness. His victims were dancers, workers, and runaways. Women who were vulnerable, women no one looked for if they went missing. He'd drive through Anchorage's red light district, looking for his next target. Sometimes he posed as a customer, sometimes a photographer. He promised them safety, money, even modeling gigs. If a victim said yes, if she got into his car, her fate was already sealed. He'd take the victims back to his house, a plain, quiet home in a neighborhood called Muldoon. Always, of course, when his family were away. Down in the basement, behind the walls of a normal suburban life, was his real world. There, he kept his tools, a chain bolted to a wooden support beam, a hunting knife, a rifle, and trophies. He kept earrings, driver's licenses, necklaces, tiny pieces of the women that he destroyed. If the victim didn't fight, she lived a little longer. Hansen would wait until morning, Then, he'd drive his victims to a small airstrip in the middle of town. This is where he kept his pride and joy, a 2-seater Super Club bush plane. He would then fly himself and the victim into the wilderness. Vast stretches of untouched forest, no roads, no help, no mercy. No one would hear them scream. Once they landed, he would let the victim out. Sometimes he'd give them a head start, sometimes he would taunt them. He would then stalk them through the trees and marsh, waiting for a moment they stumbled, cried, or begged. After killing them, he would then return to Anchorage, bake bread and cakes, and spend time with his family. No one suspected a thing. Hanson's crimes earned him the moniker the Butcher Baker, and he would eventually confess to killing these women. It's believed that he murdered around 17 to 21 women in this way. He eventually showed the authorities where many of his victims were buried. During an absolute marathon investigation in 1984, Hanson provided the chilling details of his crimes, but then he was asked about the mystery of Eglunta Annie, and he admitted responsibility. He told the police that he had killed her. Hanson confirmed that Annie was his victim, the very first one he ever killed. Hanson recounted the murder with disturbing clarity, and his story matched the evidence from Annie's remains, lending credibility to his account. According to Robert, sometime in late 1979, he encountered Annie. Tragically, he could not recall her real name, which shows how little he thought of his victims. Hanson used his standard method. He offered her money and got her into his car. But as Hanson drove, Annie grew worried. Instead of heading towards his house in Muldoon, he turned onto an old road leading north into a dark, sparsely populated area. Annie realized that something was horribly wrong. She begged him to turn around and take her back to the city. At first, she did this calmly, but then she began to panic. Hanson lied to her, saying that he was only going a little bit further to a safe spot where no one would find them. But she didn't believe him. She demanded that he stop the car at once and let her out, but Hanson then pulled out a gun and told her to cooperate if she wanted to live. As the two were driving down a lonely track near Eglunta, Hanson's vehicle got stuck in the mud off a road. Seizing the opportunity, Annie bolted from the truck and ran into the darkness, desperate to escape. But Hanson was an experienced tracker and hunter. Like in some cliché horror movie, he grabbed a knife and a flashlight, and he began to pursue her. In his confession, Hanson chillingly described how he chased her down in the forest, eventually catching up to her as she stumbled. He yanked her to the ground by her long hair, and a violent struggle ensued. At one point, she managed to pull out a knife from her purse to defend herself, but Hanson was able to overpower her. He then stabbed her one single time in the back as she lay face down, exactly as the autopsy had indicated. Hanson recalled that as he plunged the blade into her back, Annie screamed, "Please don't kill me." He said that these were her final words before she was killed. The attack punctured her lung and she quickly succumbed to her injury. Robert Hanson had committed his first known murder. He dragged her body back to an area near the power line and hastily dug a shallow grave to hide her. He was satisfied that the remote location would keep her concealed, and so he left the scene. Annie's remains lay in the grave through the winter snows and the spring of 1980, until the work crew uncovered her by chance. With Hanson's admission in 1984, authorities finally knew how Annie had died and who killed her. But still, they had absolutely no idea who she was. Hanson was convicted of multiple murders. He was given a life sentence, plus 461 years in prison. He died behind bars in 2014, never having provided any further insight into Annie's identity. For law enforcement, a frustrating reality remained. Closing the case on the murder did not close the case on the victim's identity. The file on Annie stayed open as Jane Doe Investigation, the oldest such case in Alaska. As one cold case investigator later said, solving who she is became a matter of justice and equality. They said that no matter how she lived, she deserves just as much of a search for her people as any other victim. In Alaska, the tale of Annie has become one of the state's most infamous true crime mysteries, and the public's response has been one of enduring empathy. Strangers still bring flowers to her simple grave that just reads, Jane Doe died 1980, and locals still occasionally pause by the bronze plaque. In the last few years, there have been some efforts to finally put a real name to Annie. A 2020 forensic facial reconstruction of Annie was created based on Annie's skull. This updated composite image was released to the public 41 years after her death, with the hope that someone might recognize her face. The portrait shows a young woman with light brown hair tied back with a subtle, haunting gaze. This 2020 image was widely circulated on social media. It was shared hundreds of times online in just a matter of days, and local news ran segments on Annie's cold case with the new look. But tragically, no identification came. Over the years, a few tips have trickled in, but so far none of them have panned out. Amateur investigators share their research. Investigators hope that someone somewhere who knew a girl who went to Alaska and never returned might make the connection upon seeing the composite, but as more time passes, that possibility dwindles. Investigators believe that Annie may have been one of the many young women who drifted into Anchorage's nightlife, far from family and unlikely to be immediately reported missing. She might have left behind a family who never knew of what became of her, possibly assuming that she chose to live a new life in Alaska and ran away. It's tragic to think that there are people out there who could go missing and no one cares to check on them. As of 2025, Eklunter Annie remains unidentified but not forgotten, and this is a story that won't truly end until we can speak her real name and tell her full story. In the meantime, her case serves as a reminder of the many, many nameless victims of crime, and the enduring commitment to identify them. Hopefully someday soon, through science or luck or even both, Annie will finally be given a real name, and the final chapter of her story will be written. Follow me on Instagram, thank you. This case takes place in the USA in the year 1971. In a quiet suburb, one man became a family annihilator, which is an actual term, reserved for the most diabolical criminals. The house sat untouched for weeks after. Inside was silence broken only by religious hymns he kept playing through a speaker system. Photographs dotted around the house which showed a typical American family living the American dream, until the perpetrator destroyed his own family and cut his face out of every single photograph to preserve his freedom. No one knew where he went or who he became. That was until it was uncovered nearly 20 years later, and by a strange twist of fate. Meet John Emil List. John was born in Bay City, Michigan in 1925. He was an only child and was raised in a strict Lutheran home. John was described as a quiet and meticulous boy who found comfort in order and religious devotion. He kept himself to himself and rarely stepped out of line. When the Second World War began, John enlisted in the United States Army and served as a laboratory technician. After the war, he used government funding to earn degrees in business and accounting at the University of Michigan. But by 1950, the Army recalled him to active duty for the Korean War. It was around this time that John met a woman named Helen Taylor, a widow whose first husband had died in combat. John and Helen married in Maryland in 1951. He adopted Helen's daughter from her previous marriage and later had 3 children of his own, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. Patricia was the eldest. She was passionate about theatre and hoped to one day become an actress. But John disapproved of this ambition and considered it morally inappropriate. At school, Patricia was friendly and outgoing, But at home, she often clashed with her father over her interests and her behaviour. John Jr. was different. He was athletic and studious. He played on the high school soccer team and was known as a polite young man and a dependable student. He was the most physically active of the three and often tried to meet his father's strict standards and aligned with his interests. Frederick was the youngest. He was quiet, gentle, and liked to get lost in a good book. Out of the three, he had the calmest temperament and was very attached to his older siblings. All three children attended Sunday school and youth groups at their church. To outsiders, the List children were well behaved and devout. They lived under the heavy rules of their father's faith and his high expectations. Over the next decade, John moved his family from state to state as he climbed the corporate ladder. By 1965, he had secured a role as vice president and chief accountant at a bank in New Jersey. With increased earnings, he purchased a 19-room Victorian mansion named Breeze Knoll in the affluent suburb of Westfield. John's mother Alma was aging, and she needed some support, so she moved in with the family. From the outside, John's life looked like a portrait of success and moral order. He attended church, taught Sunday school, and even led a Boy Scout group. Neighbours said he was polite, but rather stiff. He always wore a tie, even when he was mowing the lawn. But the neighbours didn't see the pressure building inside. Helen had contracted syphilis years before, and she never told John. When he found out, the marriage deteriorated. In public, he kept a composed exterior, but behind closed doors, the cracks were showing. By 1971, John's carefully managed image had begun to collapse. He had lost his job at the bank earlier that year and told no one. Every morning, he put on his suit and left the house as if he was going to work, when in reality, he spent his days sitting at the train station reading newspapers and avoiding suspicion. At home, bills were piling up. He was behind approximately $11,000 on the mortgage for his mansion. By any standards, this is a huge amount, but especially at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $88,000 in today's money. He had taken out a second mortgage to stay afloat, but even then, that was no longer enough. And his pride would not let him admit defeat or accept help. He believed that asking for assistance or relying on welfare would bring disgrace to the family name. After a while, John began to view his situation as hopeless. He was convinced that failure would destroy not just the family's lifestyle, but also their spiritual integrity. But not only this, Helen's condition made things worse. She had become increasingly unwell and withdrawn. She spent many days in bed, suffering from headaches and depression, and she used alcohol to dull the pain. John had to cook and manage the household on top of his secret unemployment. During the small amount of public appearances, she would even humiliate him. She would often mention how her first husband was sexually favourable. She no longer attended church, and to John, her absence from worship was a sign of moral decline. Being so rigidly dogmatic in his belief system, he believed her soul was at risk, or so he would later say. The children were also embracing the freedoms of the era in ways that alarmed their conservative father. Patricia had grown passionate about acting and theatre. John found this to be deeply inappropriate. He worried that she would abandon her faith and corrupt her younger brothers. Rumours then began to circulate that Patricia was researching witchcraft, either for school or out of personal curiosity. Again, in John's worldview, this was a sign of spiritual danger. He confronted her about her interests and became increasingly obsessed with her behaviour. He once caught her smoking and reacted with fury. The modern clothing, the music, the independence, all of it made John feel that the moral structure of his family was disintegrating before his very eyes. And the family could see that this was getting to him. Allegedly, Patricia half-jokingly told a teacher that her father might kill them all, and tragically, she was right. John was already thinking along these lines. He believed his family was drifting too far away from the values that he cherished. He began to see death as the only way to save them. A psychiatrist would later describe John's thinking as fixated and inflexible, but John saw it as clarity. He convinced himself that God would understand what he was about to do, and so he had to go to work. He planned everything in detail. He made sure the children's schools and employers believed that they would be away visiting relatives in early November. He cancelled deliveries to the house, including milk, newspapers, and mail. He even checked that Helen's mother would not be visiting as expected. By the first week of November, all preparations were complete. The house was ready. John saw himself as a man who had no other options. He couldn't save his family from ruin in this life, so instead, he would send them to heaven. On the morning of Tuesday, the 9th of November, 1971, John woke up early and prepared himself for what he had planned. He helped his children get ready for school and sent them off as usual. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick each walked out of the door, unaware of their father's sinister plans. The house became quiet. John then headed for his garage to retrieve 2 handguns. He had a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and a .22 caliber revolver. He chose his moment carefully. His wife Helen was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking her customary morning coffee. Approaching from behind, John raised the 9mm pistol and shot Helen in the side of the head at close range. Blood gushed from her skull as she face-planted onto the tabletop. She died instantly. John took a moment to collect himself. He then climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. His mother Alma was in her small apartment in the mansion preparing herself breakfast. John entered and approached his mother directly. He said nothing. He just raised the revolver and fired 1 shot above her left eye. Alma collapsed and died in her chair. John then placed a cloth over her wound. He later claimed that he killed his mother to spare her the shock of what was to come. He returned to the ground floor and dragged Helen's body into the ballroom. He then attempted to move Alma's body, but he found it too heavy, so he just left her upstairs. He cleaned the blood from the kitchen floor and placed the spent shell casings in the bin. He then made himself some lunch like nothing had happened and sat at the table where he had just murdered his own wife. With the 2 adult women dead, John's next move was to deal with his children as they returned home. Later that afternoon, Patricia arrived home first. John met her at the front door. Patricia could have never expected what was going to happen next. Before Patricia could even say anything as she entered the house, John raised his pistol once more and shot his daughter in the head. He then dragged her body into the ballroom and laid her beside her mother. Soon after, Frederick came through the door, the youngest. John shot him in the same manner as his sister, mother, and grandmother. He then picked up his son's lifeless body and carried him into the ballroom. John Jr. was at school for the afternoon and had a football match, so John drove to the school and watched the game from the sidelines. This is a bone-chilling thought, knowing that the rest of the family had just experienced a brutal end. When the game ended, he offered his son a lift home. The 2 got in the car and began driving back to the mansion. They entered the house together. At some point inside, John took out the pistol and fired at his son. But unlike the others, John Jr. didn't die immediately. There were signs of a slight struggle, but John fired repeatedly, striking him with multiple bullets until he stopped moving. He ended up shooting his son in the chest and his face, and inevitably his body was added to the row in the ballroom. By 5 o'clock in the evening, John had murdered 5 members of his family. He arranged their bodies on sleeping bags beneath the Tiffany original stained glass skylight. In effect, he had turned his house into a tomb. What followed was an eerie and sinister ritual. He lowered the thermostat to slow decomposition. He then set a radio to play religious music throughout the intercom system, and finally, the lights were turned off. He wrote a letter to his pastor, 5 pages long, in which he described his actions. He claimed his family had lost their faith and they were slipping into corruption. He also said he could not let them face the shame of financial ruin. He believed he had saved them from damnation. Before signing the letter, he asked for forgiveness and explained that he intended to disappear. Next, he proceeded to sign the letter and left it on his desk. John then removed every photograph of himself from the house. This action in particular was meticulous. Every photograph in the 19-bedroom household. He took a set of scissors and cut his face out like he was never there. It was clear that he did not want the police to have an accurate image of his face. Now, after this, some believe that he left right away, but some others think that he slept in the house that night with the bodies inside the home. However, before he disappeared, he withdrew cash from his mother's bank accounts and packed a few belongings. He then drove to JFK Airport in New York and abandoned the family car to create a false lead. He did not board a flight that day. Instead, he took a train and vanished into the darkness. By the time the police found the bodies, nearly a month later, John was gone. For nearly 4 weeks, no one realized that anything was wrong. John had cancelled everything, so nothing had piled up on the doorstep or at the mailbox. And of course, he told the children's schools and part-time jobs that they were travelling to see a sick relative and wouldn't be around for some time. The lights in the mansion turned on and off automatically. Neighbours believed that the house was simply empty, but inside, the bodies remained undisturbed, rotting. Over time, the lights began to burn out one by one, but still, no one checked inside. But Patricia's drama teacher grew concerned, and she tried to phone the home, but the phone calls went unanswered. By early December, neighbours hadn't seen them for some time, and so they contacted the police. On the 17th of December 1971, police officers performed a welfare check. They found that the doors were locked, so one officer crawled through an open basement window, and he noted that the house was unusually cold. He could also hear something rather eerie given the context. He heard organ music echoing softly from the speakers throughout the home. And then the smell hit him. The sound was accompanied by the smell of decay thick within the air. In the ballroom, the police discovered the bodies of Helen, Patricia, John Jr. and Frederick, each laying on a sleeping bag with a gunshot wound to the head. And upstairs, they found Alma dead in her apartment. They found a note which warned them not to touch anything and to call the family's pastor. The FBI was then brought in to assist in what would become one of the largest fugitive manhunts of the decade. Agents traced John's movements to JFK Airport. There, they found the family car abandoned in a long-term car park, and they quickly discovered that this was left there to mislead them. There were no credit card transactions, no job applications in his name, and no paper trail. And the only image the police could use was from an old passport and a faded high school yearbook. There was hardly anything to go off. Investigators distributed wanted posters across the country. Tips came in, but none led to his location. As you can imagine, before long, the case went cold. The months kept passing, and then years. The FBI filed 10 volumes of sightings and false leads. Some suggested that he had fled to Canada. Others claimed that he was living as a drifter in California. One tipster even speculated that he was the infamous hijacker known as D.B. Cooper. But that theory was investigated and it was dismissed. So where did John go? Well, John had built a new life. He travelled to Michigan and then on to Colorado. By early 1972, he had created a new identity under the name Robert Clark. He initially worked as a cook in the Denver area and then moved to central Denver and found a role as a tax preparer. Soon after, he joined a Lutheran church and volunteered to drive the elderly members to service. He kept to himself and never spoke about the past. He knew that his new churchgoer friends would not approve of his murderous ways. In 1977, during one of the church's picnics, he met a woman called Dolores, and the two started to date. By 1985, he married her, and the couple moved to Maryland, Virginia. John had told her that his first wife had died from cancer, so Dolores never suspected the truth. But that didn't mean that the truth wouldn't be unearthed. In 1989, the television show America's Most Wanted aired a special about the John List case. By then, 17.5 years had passed since the killings. A forensic artist had created an aged progressed clay bust of what John might look like as an older man. The artist, named Frank Bender, had created an eerily accurate depiction, even down to the thick glasses and his receding hairline. This must have been a difficult task, due to the limited photographic evidence besides his school yearbook photo found at the house years prior. Investigators saw this as a bit of a long shot, but the segment reached millions of viewers. The response was overwhelming, and led to over 200 tips identifying possible John List sightings around the country, but nearly all of them were nonsense. However, one tip did stand out. A woman named Wanda Flannery had been a neighbor of the Clarks in Denver. She saw the bust on TV and immediately recognized it as her former neighbor, Robert Clark, but she knew him as Bob. But Wanda didn't know Bob's new address, but the FBI soon tracked it down. Less than 2 weeks after the broadcast, on the 1st of June 1989, the FBI and local police descended on his small, quiet accounting office in Virginia. John List was finally taken into custody without incident. At the time of his arrest, he didn't confess his identity. In fact, he insisted calmly that he was Robert Clark, and that this was simply just a case of mistaken identity. However, the investigators were well prepared. They obtained fingerprints from this Bob Clark, and within hours, they had matched it to an old military service print of John List. The alias had finally been unmasked. Confronted with this evidence, John eventually admitted to who he really was. He was then extradited back to New Jersey to face justice for the murders. In August of 1989, the Union County Grand Jury indicted John on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge for each his wife, mother, and 3 children. John List pleaded not guilty, and his case proceeded to trial in early 1990. After many, many years, John stood in a courtroom to answer for his crimes. By this point, he was a soft-spoken 64-year-old man and a former Sunday school teacher, and he was accused of slaughtering his entire family in cold blood. So of course, when the trial opened, it quickly became a media circus. John's defense did not deny that he was the killer. The physical evidence and his own confession letter made it undeniable. Instead, they mounted an insanity defense, claiming that John suffered from a mental disorder that prevented him from knowing right from wrong. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that John suffered from OCD, which made him rigid and unable to see alternatives in stressful situations. According to this psychiatrist, John's devout religious beliefs combined with his personality disorder and his financial desperation created a state of mind in which he felt like he had no choice but to murder his whole family. They then pointed to his long history of conscientious, law-abiding behavior and deep faith. They used this as evidence to claim that he wasn't a violent man by nature, but a broken man who simply snapped. The prosecutors, however, argued forcibly that John List knew exactly what he was doing, and that this was first-degree murder plain and simple. They emphasized the level of planning and cold-blooded execution. John had months to reconsider, and he didn't. He shot his victims often from behind without warning, and he carried out practical steps to evade capture. The Union County prosecutor testified that John's crimes were not the result of an uncontrollable snap, but instead a calculated act by a man who wanted to get rid of what he considered to be burdens. The prosecution reminded the jury of how John List closed his bank accounts, tidied the crime scene, and carried on as normal at his son's soccer game. These are hardly the actions of someone going through a psychotic break, and in fact show that he was of a deliberate and rational mind. But the most damning piece of evidence came from John himself, the evidence of John's own confession letter to his pastor. In that very letter, John spelled out his motive in great detail, complaining about financial troubles, moral decay, and explicitly admitting, "I killed them to save them from evil." This letter left little doubt of premeditation. Confronted with John's own words and the overwhelming evidence, the jury found him sane and guilty on all 5 counts of murder after just 9 days of trial. On the 12th of April 1990, John Emil List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At the sentencing the very next day, John finally broke his stoic silence. In a brief statement he said that he was sorry for what happened, but he stopped short of full responsibility. The judge then imposed the maximum sentence, 5 life terms in prison to be served consecutively. This effectively ensured that John List would never be eligible for parole. John List, who was 64 at the time, was led away in handcuffs to begin his life behind bars. The long-delayed reckoning had finally arrived. Over time, he gave a handful of interviews to journalists. In one, he expressed regret for what he had done, but insisted that he believed it was necessary at the time. He said he prayed for forgiveness every day, but he never showed remorse for the lives he had taken. John said he never did anything to himself because that would be a sin which would have prevented him from entering heaven. He believed that by staying alive and repenting, he could still be reunited with his family in the afterlife. This logic underpins the warped thinking that had driven him to commit mass murder. He never fully acknowledged the scale of his crimes, and in interviews he always remained calm and rational. To many, he still looked like an elderly accountant rather than a man who had executed his entire family. The town of Westfield never forgot what happened. The mansion where the murders occurred was destroyed by fire in 1972. The blaze was ruled as suspicious, but no one was ever charged. Due to disrepair, the house was later demolished. A new property was built on the site, but the land remained associated with the tragedy. John's story became a fixture in true crime media. Books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations were produced over the years. Writers and psychologists studied the case as a textbook example of a family annihilator. This term describes a person, usually a father, who kills their entire family in a single act of control and destruction. John List died in prison in 2008 from complications related to pneumonia. He was 82 years old. He never showed remorse, and he never sought forgiveness from the extended family. He likely remained content with what he had done. Subscriber, I'll come over there and do it for you. This case takes place in the USA in the year 2002. And buckle up as well, because this is a really weird one. This is the case of Dr. O.C. Smith, otherwise known as the man in the barbed wire mask. Dr. Smith was born in 1952 in the USA. To say that this man is interesting would be an understatement. At one point he was a Navy captain and was present in multiple military operations, including in Desert Storm. One person would later say that he was a very interesting man, and that there were even stories about him being a mercenary. Following his work in the military, he served as the chief medical examiner for Shelby County, Tennessee, and he built a reputation as a hard-working, hands-on forensic pathologist. His colleagues admired his hard work and dedication to his profession. He was known to rush out to crime scenes at all hours of the night. Whatever the job required, he would always do, and he worked on some of the city's biggest cases. Dr. Smith was incredibly well respected, and his expertise made him a sought-after expert in court. He often testified in high-profile murder cases, explaining complex forensic findings in plain language for the jury. helping to bring many people to justice. Although saying this, he wasn't without controversy. Some colleagues privately remarked that he reaches in his findings, and by doing this, he could have upset some dangerous people. And there was one case in particular that could have sparked what was to come. Dr. Smith became involved in the case of Philip Workman, a Tennessee death row inmate. Philip had been convicted of killing a Memphis police officer during a robbery back in 1981, and by the early 2000s, the case had gained traction amongst anti-death penalty activists. Philip Workman insisted that he never shot the police officer. He claimed that the policeman was accidentally killed by a fellow police officer's bullet. The bullet that killed the officer was mysteriously never found, leaving the case to be somewhat controversial, and this is where Dr. Smith came into the picture. In 2001, Philip Workman attempted to plead his innocence, and an investigation was launched. Dr. Smith performed a new forensic technique to analyze the evidence. He used an electron microscope to examine skin samples from the officer who was killed. In his findings, Dr. Smith claimed to find tiny flakes of aluminium in the officer's wounds. This linked Philip to the murder, as the officers didn't have this kind of ammunition. However, following this, Dr. Smith was criticized. One of the leading pathologists said that the tests he conducted didn't meet peer-reviewed standards, and they shouldn't have been accepted. People began to believe that Dr. Smith did this to keep Philip Workman on death row. After all, Dr. Smith was openly incredibly pro-police, and many of Philip Workman's supporters believe that he had sent an innocent man to his death. And so, Dr. Smith began receiving some rather disturbing mail in the post. In one letter, the writer called Dr. Smith's work evil and proclaimed God is calling upon him to act. Others called Dr. Smith a killer and a soulless demon, accusing him of lying in his testimony about the Workman case. This of course made Dr. Smith rather anxious, worried for his safety, and rightly so. The police began looking into the matter. However, it wasn't really taken too seriously, or at least, I couldn't really find too much info on the investigation of the letters at first. One investigator, however, did note that the letters seemed to have a religious theme to them. God and the devil would often be referenced. But in March of 2002, the police began looking into this a little more seriously. Late one night, a security guard discovered a crudely built bomb and a Molotov cocktail. These were left outside the Shelby County Regional Forensic Center, the county morgue where Dr. Smith worked. The makeshift bomb was found in the very same rear stairwell that Dr. Smith often used. The bomb was accompanied by another letter, again making threats against Dr. Smith's life. Thankfully, no one was hurt, and the bomb was defused. With this, the police began to conduct regular paroles around the area, hoping to maybe catch someone in the act next time. But Dr. Smith, he seemed to just carry on with his life like normal, which made people he worked with wonder, how could he be so brave, or maybe stupid? And now we arrive to the night it all happened. In the early hours of the 2nd of June 2002, a security guard who worked near the centre noticed something strange. Dr. Smith's car was still parked outside, well past midnight. This was unusual, especially given the latest happenings. The doctor would work late, but not this late. Concerned, the guard decided to check up on the doctor to make sure that all was well, but all wasn't well. The guard cautiously approached the building. He could hear someone shouting for help inside. He opened the door and walked inside the building. He then turned to the stairwell. The guard looked in horror as he found Dr. Smith handcuffed to a window guard, wrapped in barbed wire, with a motion-sensitive bomb strapped to his throat. Horrified, the guard immediately called the authorities, and within minutes, the police and bomb squad arrived on the scene. Dr. Smith was freed, and the bomb was deactivated. He was then transported to the hospital, where he was treated for some minor injuries, cuts and bruises, along with some chemical burns to his face and body. After getting patched up, the doctor was asked exactly what had happened to him, and this is what he said. On the 1st of June 2002, Dr. Smith had been working late at the forensic centre as he often did, Sometime shortly after 10 p.m, he locked up and headed out the back door into the dark stairwell leading to the exit. It's at this point that Dr. Smith then claimed that a shadowy figure jumped out from the darkness and began attacking him. Dr. Smith said that whoever this mysterious attacker was, he was around 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. As Dr. Smith turned to look at the attacker threw chemical liquid straight into his face. He said the chemical burned like fire, and he was even able to instantly recognize the searing pain of lye. Lye is a strong chemical that is capable of causing burns to a person's skin. Dr. Smith then stumbled in pain. He was blinded and in immense pain as the chemical had made its way into his eyes. The attacker then splashed his face again with the chemical, causing further burns. Instinctively, Dr. Smith raised his hands to his eyes in pain as the mysterious attacker began beating him, leading to Dr. Smith falling to the ground. This unknown man then pulled out coils of barbed wire and began wrapping the jagged metal around the doctor's body and head. By this point, he was so overwhelmed with pain that he could do little to stop his attacker from doing as he pleased. Then, according to Dr. Smith, this mysterious attacker dragged him back up the steps. The stairwell had a metal security gate over a window, and he was forced upright against it. The attacker then produced a pair of handcuffs and padlocks. His arms were then spread apart and locked high up to the bars, while his feet were tied together below, resembling a crucified man. As Dr. Smith was helplessly bound, the mysterious man went and retrieved a small homemade bomb. The bomb was about the size of a can of soda, and he superglued it to the doctor's neck. On one side of the bomb it said, "Steel in the hands of the King of Kings." On the other side of the device were inscribed the letters JMJ, which likely meant Jesus, Mary, Joseph. The attacker then spoke to Dr. Smith. He said the words, "Push it, pull it, twist it, and you die. Welcome to death row." The attacker then informed him that the bomb was motion sensitive. One wrong move could detonate the bomb. As suddenly as this mysterious man had appeared, he left, leaving Dr. Smith beaten, burned and bound, and literally booby-trapped. Terrified and alone, he basically waited to die. Dr. Smith later said at that moment he didn't care about anything else except for not moving a single muscle. Knowing the bomb was motion sensitive, he tried his very best to remain still, breathing as little as possible and as shallow as possible. If he struggled, the bomb could detonate. If he did nothing, it could have a timer and he could have blown up at any time. All he could do was wait. After some time passed, he began making some noise, hoping that someone would come. And around midnight, roughly 2 hours after the strange attack, the security officer who happened to be patrolling found the doctor. When saving him, the bomb squad bravely put their lives at risk. One of them held the bomb to keep it stable, essentially holding it in his hands while the others cut the wires. One mistake, and everyone could have died. Thankfully, everyone was safe in the end. After the bomb was taken care of, Dr. Smith was taken away in an ambulance to the hospital. The paramedics were rather shocked, not only by the attack, but by how his injuries were relatively minor. He had some chemical burns on his face, along with some red irritated eyes from the chemicals, and he had some scratches from the wire. But he had no deep slashes. In fact, he hadn't even lost much blood. One paramedic would later say, "For all the brutal restraint, there wasn't any blood that night. Even a cat scratch would draw blood, yet Dr. Smith was hardly bleeding at all." This paramedic found this to be suspicious. The police then interviewed him about the series of events, where he gave the account I just described. Now, as you can imagine, news of this attack spread rapidly. A respected doctor, bound in barbed wire, with a bomb strapped to his throat. This kind of thing is usually only found in crime books, but this was real life. Newspapers' front page shared the story of Dr. Smith, the man in the barbed wire mask. The police issued warnings. Locals became worried. A madman willing to do such a thing was now on the loose, and no one knew if he would ever strike again. But the real question was, who was this mysterious attacker? After the attack, Dr. Smith basically hid away and denied all interviews. He became deeply worried for his safety. He bought a guard dog and carried a firearm at all times. Due to the horrifying nature of the crime, the police needed to find this attacker, and they needed to find him fast. Time was very much of the essence. Would he strike again? No one knew. A multi-agency task force was created to find the mystery man. Federal ATF agents, FBI, and local police joined forces and treated the case as a top priority. Investigators quickly connected the dots between the barbed wire attack, the staircase bomb, and the letters that had been sent to the doctor. The pattern suggested someone with a religious background and someone who was upset about the role Dr. Smith played in the controversial cop killer case of Philip Workman. And because of this, Philip Workman was even questioned. Maybe he had something to do with the attack. Maybe he had people on the outside who would have carried out this attack on his behalf. Whilst on death row, Philip was questioned, but he denied any involvement and even went as far as saying that he might be getting framed himself. He believed that this attack was set up to ruin support for him. Philip then told the investigators to explain step by step exactly what happened to Dr. Smith, or at least what Dr. Smith claimed to have happened. Upon hearing the story, Philip sat there puzzled. He told the investigators firmly again that he had nothing to do with the attack. But then he told the investigators something strange. He told them that the story seemed far-fetched and that maybe they should investigate Dr. Smith and not him. Philip believed that Dr. Smith had done this to himself. However, the police dismissed Philip's theory, and instead they turned to Philip Workman's family members, known friends, and other death penalty activists in the region. Despite extensive interviews and even surveillance, no solid evidence or suspect emerged from those leads. And with this, to the police's surprise, Philip was ruled out as a suspect in orchestrating the attack. Although there was still plenty of other cases to go off. Dr. Smith had worked with hundreds of high-profile cases, and investigators began looking into possible leads. But none of those leads led anywhere, and the case was going nowhere. As months went by, the case increasingly baffled investigators. Nothing made any sense. The police created some kind of profile. Someone who was incredibly determined, capable of devising complicated plots, and oddly fixated on biblical metaphors and symbolism. Yet, despite a 15-month investigation following the attack, with over 100 possible leads pursued, the investigators just couldn't find the man responsible. And as more things just didn't add up, the investigators began to wonder. Was Philip Workman right all along? Was Dr. Smith actually capable of staging the whole attack? It's at this point that some of the team began looking into whether or not Dr. Smith could have done this himself. Right away, one thing stood out to the team of investigators. The elaborate nature of the crime seemed to be unusual for an outside assailant. An expert recreated the scene and noted how much equipment the mysterious attacker had to carry and deploy in the dark. The expert said, "This is an incredibly complex crime. This person is going to have to be standing out there in the middle of the night with all of this stuff." The attacker would have needed to lurk outside the morgue carrying a bottle of lye, lengths of barbed wire, padlocks, and a heavy chain and cable, not to mention a bomb. Would this really be possible? Also, whoever did this required insider knowledge of Dr. Smith's habits and the way in which he would exit the building. Investigators then noticed something else. How could someone wrap a struggling victim in barbed wire with zero significant injuries or bleeding? Also, Dr. Smith's eyes were irritated by the chemicals, but they were not permanently damaged. It was as if the chemicals had hit his face in a way that mostly avoided the eyeballs, like careful self-application. As they dug deeper, there were more and more inconsistencies. In his first statement, Dr. Smith said that his ankles were tied with the barbed wire first and then his wrists. But then later, during a more intense interrogation in 2003, his story subtly changed. He said that his hands were tied first. Under pressure, he seemed to be mixing up the details. Dr. Smith was also a military veteran with combat and mercenary experience. He was in good shape and was trained to handle stress. Yet, he described being completely overpowered by a single attacker. So the question was, why didn't he fight back? Well, he was actually asked this question. Dr. Smith responded that, "Machismo gets you killed. You have a choice. You can resist, or you can ride it out." But the police didn't buy this. They believed that he did this to himself. And so Dr. Smith was interviewed again. The police flatly told him that they believed he was lying and that he had staged the entire attack. Dr. Smith, for his part, stuck to his story. He theorized that he was being targeted because of the Philip Workman case, suggesting that some enraged person wanted revenge on him for his testimony. Dr. Smith tried to explain away these particular details. For example, when asked why the barbed wire hadn't cut him, he argued that it was old and rusty, so it would scratch him but not tear the skin. But this didn't matter. On the 11th of February 2004, Dr. Smith was charged with possessing an unregistered explosive device and with lying to federal investigators about the attack. They believed that Dr. Smith had faked absolutely everything. The story had made national headlines when Dr. Smith was the victim, and now it was making headlines again with an even more unbelievable twist. Dr. Smith was forced to step down from his position with great reluctance, and he complied. He stuck to his story and maintained that he was innocent. When addressing the media, he said, "I just never dreamed it would end like this." Dr. Smith was then offered a plea deal. No prison time if he would simply confess to staging the attack. For his charges, Dr. Smith was looking at up to 20 years in prison. However, for Dr. Smith, there was no chance. He said he was innocent, and he refused the plea deal. He told the media that he would never quit, and he would never sign that piece of paper. He lawyered up and prepared for the fight of his life in court. The stage was now set for one of the most bizarre legal showdowns in US legal history, the case of the man in the barbed wire mask. The trial began in 2005. Over the course of around 3 weeks, jurors heard testimony from nearly 60 witnesses. The prosecution claimed that Dr. Smith had staged the entire attack, although they did also admit that there was no single smoking gun piece of evidence, nothing concrete. Instead, they presented a puzzle made up of smaller pieces of evidence, all pointing towards an inside job. The minimal injuries inconsistent with a brutal attack, the inconsistencies in Dr. Smith's accounts, the extensive planning required, and the utter lack of any other viable suspect after a thorough investigation. The prosecution even demonstrated with a volunteer that it was indeed physically possible for someone to bind themselves with barbed wire and set up a scenario like Dr. Smith's. As far-fetched as it sounds, it could be done. But what could the motive possibly be? Well, an expert came forward and explained the concept of fictitious disorder, a psychological condition where a person fakes trauma or illness to get attention or sympathy. The most well-known form is Munchausen syndrome, where a patient secretly makes themselves sick just to receive care. The prosecutors claimed that Dr. Smith orchestrated the attack to paint himself as a victim hero, similar to the recent case of Jussie Smollett. The prosecution also claimed that Dr. Smith had a history of telling dramatic false stories. Apparently, Dr. Smith had told a story to his colleagues about serving in Africa where his family was massacred, a story that was completely untrue. Things weren't looking too good for him. But Dr. Smith's defense team portrayed him as a man wrongfully accused. They pointed out that he voluntarily spoke with investigators for hours, even without a lawyer present, because he believed in his own innocence. The defense claimed that a guilty person would have lawyered up and shut up. There was also a lack of evidence. There was no fingerprints on the bomb, no purchase history for barbed wire, and no receipts for the purchase of any chemicals. There was no eyewitnesses saying that they saw him set anything up. The case was entirely circumstantial. Dr. Smith's wife Marge spoke up, expressing that she believed her husband would never do such a thing. The defense also raised the question, why would anyone superglue and then strap a live bomb to their throat? After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated on Dr. Smith's case. Dr. Smith was incredibly worried. He told the media, "When I listened to the closing arguments of the prosecution, I'd have voted myself guilty." The jurors deliberated for some time. Then finally, there was a decision. The jurors were split. 3 of the 12 jurors had voted guilty, and the other 9 were not convinced enough to convict. Some of those 9 believed that Smith was likely guilty, but felt the evidence left too much doubt. Others perhaps believed that he was innocent outright, and a few were even reportedly angry, feeling the prosecution had wasted their time without a definitive case. And so with this, the judge declared a mistrial due to the hung jury. Dr. Smith was neither convicted nor exonerated. He was, in legal terms, still innocent until proven guilty. But what do the experts think? Well, officially, law enforcement considers the case solved. They believe Dr. Smith carried out a hoax, while Dr. Smith's supporters consider him to be an innocent man who was tragically misjudged. In their eyes, the real perpetrator was never caught. Dr. Smith continued to deny any wrongdoing to the end of his days. He passed away in 2019. He never wavered in saying that a mysterious man that night attacked him. If it was a hoax, the true motive was only known to Dr. Smith, and with his passing, perhaps we will never know. Or maybe we will. Maybe one day this mystery man will be caught. The truth may never be known, but it continues to fascinate and confuse those who learn about it. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below, but either way, there's 2 options. Someone did this to him, or he did it to himself. Both are equally terrifying. If you subscribe to me, I'd be most pleased. This case takes place in the USA in the 1970s and 80s. In August of 1987, deep within Oregon's remote Molalla forest, a lone bow hunter stumbled across a grim discovery. Hidden amongst the dense trees lay the remains of a body, and within just days, investigators unearthed 6 more bodies. Whoever had done this, it was clear to see that the Molalla forest became his dumping ground. Meet Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dayton was born on the 30th of September 1953 in Moscow, Idaho. He was raised in a religious working-class family and spent his early years helping out at his father's small engine repair shop. On the surface, his childhood appeared to be somewhat ordinary, but inside the home, there were reports of violence and dysfunction. Dayton's father was an abusive man. He even killed family pets by gassing them or running them over with a car. His mother also contributed to the chaos, and in some very disturbing ways. She often walked around the home barely clothed and confided in young Dayton that intercourse with his father was painful and unsatisfying. These early experiences shaped Dayton's psyche. Because of this, he learned to associate sex with shame, pain, and control at a formative age. He became a loner and showed early signs of emotional instability and deep anger. By the 7th grade, at around 13 years old, he was arrested for shooting a BB gun at passing cars. By 16, he was already known to carry knives and get into trouble, and just 2 years later, at 18, he began to use those knives. In 1972, Dayton lured a girl, whom he had previously taken on a date, into a wooded area near Eugene, Oregon. Dayton planned to force himself upon her, but instead of doing this, he just took out his hunting knife and stabbed her repeatedly in the abdomen, and was about to leave her to die. But remarkably, the girl survived, and she did this by convincing Dayton to take her to the hospital. She promised she would marry him if he helped her, and she promised to forgive him. In a bizarre way, this ploy saved her life. She obviously immediately told the police what Dayton had done to her, and within just days he was arrested for the attack. When Dayton was facing serious charges for the Woodland attack, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation. It's here when he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, indicating a disturbed mental state with difficulty in normal social relationships. In February of 1973, he pleaded guilty to the attack and was sentenced with leniency due to his mental condition. Instead of prison, Dayton received a 4-year term of probation and was sent to Oregon State Hospital for treatment. Because he wasn't placed behind bars, he still had his freedom to leave the house. So of course, he violated his probation terms many times. On one occasion in 1973, only months after the first attack, he attacked 2 more teenage girls under frightening circumstances. He picked the girls up in his car and gave them alcohol until they were intoxicated. He then tied up both of the girls and essayed them in front of each other during a horrific attack. The encounter turned chaotic when Dayton crashed his vehicle and he got stuck in the mud in a field. Seizing an opportunity, the captive girls managed to escape and ran for help as Dayton struggled with his disabled car. Police soon arrested him again, and this time, doctors discovered that Dayton had suffered a head injury. He had brain damage to his right frontal lobe caused by the car crash during the attack. In the legal aftermath, Dayton was charged with multiple accounts of assault. However, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent back to the state psychiatric hospital for further treatment. This time, he was secured from leaving. But by November of 1974, he was discharged into the public after doctors deemed him fit to leave, which, looking back, seems extremely hard to understand. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dayton continued to cycle in and out of the justice system. He racked up accusations of violent SA offences, but often avoided long-term consequences. Yet despite these obvious red flags, a pattern of picking up young women and subjecting them to extreme violence, Dayton managed to stay mostly free. By the early 80s, he even married a woman named Sherry, and eventually became a father. To most people, he appeared to be an unremarkable mechanic and a family man, but underneath that facade, Dayton's disturbing urges only grew stronger. By the mid-1980s, Dayton was a ticking time bomb of violent compulsions. He had a well-honed method for finding victims that initially drew little attention. Dayton preferred what he called street women, women struggling with addiction or working as ladies of the night. He knew that these people were less likely to be reported missing. In Portland, Oregon's red light district, Dayton developed a predatory reputation. Local women who worked the streets found him to be incredibly odd and unsettling. He gave a false name on these streets, introducing himself as Steve the Gambler. He was known to the girls to have a particular demand. He enjoyed bondage and pain, and he fixated on women's feet, and this fetish would later play a gruesome role in his crimes. Dayton's modus operandi was chillingly consistent. Cruising in his pickup truck, he would solicit a woman or a hitchhiker, offering these women money for a good time. He often sweetened the deal by requesting unusual but seemingly consensual acts. To some women, this seemed like a good deal. But in his truck, he kept all kinds of tools and binding equipment, including extra-long shoelaces, wires, and even dog collars. Items he would use to hog-tie his victims and choke them into submission. He was also usually armed with at least one knife and then later a hacksaw. Dayton was also a heavy drinker, and he often became intoxicated before or during his attacks. He was known to consume vodka mixed with orange juice, called a screwdriver cocktail. But this habit would later be a crucial clue linking him to the crime scenes. In the moment, however, the alcohol emboldened his cruelty. In the summer of 1987, Dayton's violence escalated from sporadic attacks to a full-blown spree. Around June of 1987, women began vanishing from Portland's 82nd Avenue and downtown streets, and it happened in rapid succession. These were women who were known to frequent Portland's bars and work the streets, often to support habits or make ends meet. Dayton picked up these women one by one. First, he would gain their trust, get them drunk, and have them bound in the truck. He often tied fancy knots in a way that suggested he enjoyed the process of restraining them. Next, he would take them to a woodland, just as he did with his first ever attempted murder. He favoured the remote woodlands of the Molalla River corridor. This was an isolated area of private forestlands around 30 miles south of Portland. There, deep amongst the trees and far from prying eyes, Dayton's darkest impulses ran free. He exposed his victims to prolonged beatings, stabbings, essays, and cut them in ways to inflict pain without killing them. He would often focus his knife on certain parts of the body. This would be the chest, the abdomen, and especially the feet. Each new victim seemed to drive Dayton to further extremes of brutality, as though he were trying to satisfy something deep within him that was insatiable. Yet, no matter how much pain he ever inflicted, it was never enough for him. Dayton's double life went unnoticed by those close to him. He continued to return home to his wife and his young child in Oregon. After committing these heinous acts, he concealed any evidence away from his family. They had no idea. By late July of 1987, he had left a string of corpses in the forest. These women were Retha Giles, aged 16, Tonya Johnston, aged 18, Cynthia Dean DeVore, aged 20, Lisa Mock, 23, Nondan Cervantes, aged 26, Maureen Hodges, aged 26, and Christine Adams, aged 35. 7 victims, but for Dayton, there was room for one more. In the early morning hours of the 7th of August 1987, Dayton committed one last act that ultimately led to his downfall. His final victim was Jennifer Lisa Smith, a 25-year-old mother of 2 who needed money. Dayton picked Jennifer up on Portland's Union Avenue and drove her to a Denny's car park. It was gone midnight when Dayton began his familiar routine with Jennifer. He persuaded her to remove her clothing and allowed him to bind her wrists and ankles with shoelaces. Jennifer likely expected a quick transaction, but tragically, it wasn't. Jennifer found herself hogtied and lying face down on the truck seat, tied up on her hands and knees, with her hands and feet secured behind her back against the dashboard. In this vulnerable position, she could do little to fight back when Dayton suddenly grabbed for his knife. He then began his frenzied attack. Dayton had stabbed Jennifer at least 7 times in her chest, abdomen, back, and her neck. Multiple witnesses in the vicinity were alerted by Jennifer's piercing screams at around 2:30 a.m. A woman named Sherry was inside the nearby Denny's when she heard the shrieks and ran outside to help. What she and others saw was truly horrifying. Jennifer had actually managed to escape her bindings and stumbled out of the pickup truck. She was completely naked and covered in blood. She was able to make it just a few meters across the car park, but soon she fell, and Dayton stood over her with a knife in his hand. Jennifer was gravely injured. Her throat had been cut, and she had been stabbed all over her body. She was bleeding profusely and struggling to breathe, yet somehow she was still alive in that moment. Dayton had noticed that his actions had aroused attention. He was about to be caught, so he took off on foot towards his truck. Sherry rushed to the young woman's side and pressed her hands against the stab wounds, desperately trying to stop the bleeding whilst telling Jennifer to hold on. Several other bystanders sprang into action as Dayton started the engine and sped out of the parking lot. 2 brave men leapt into their own cars and began to chase him down. In the chaos, some tried to block the lot's exits with their vehicles, but Dayton's pickup jumped the curb and tore across the vegetation to escape into the street. A high-speed pursuit then ensued throughout the dark suburban roads. One determined witness was 34-year-old Richard. He followed closely behind Dayton, reaching speeds up to 100 miles per hour. During this dangerous chase, Richard managed to get a clear view of Dayton's license plate. He knew he couldn't safely force the truck off the road, so instead, he reduced his speed and wrote down the plate number on a scrap of paper before returning to Denny's to hand it over to the police. Tragically, Jennifer Lisa Smith could not be saved. She suffered massive internal bleeding and organ damage, including deep punctures to her lungs and her heart. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, making her the 8th and final murder victim. Or so we know. Once the police got the license plate, they were able to find Dayton's residence at dawn. When they got there, they learned from his family that he might be at his engine repair shop in Woodburn. At around 5:35 a.m., the police arrived at the shop and found Dayton inside. Right away, the police noticed blood smears on Dayton's boots and around the shop entrance. It was also clear that he had been drinking. When the police asked him what he had been doing that night and why his boots were covered in blood, he immediately lied. He claimed he had injured himself with a saw, but he was fine now because he drove to the hospital for treatment. He then went on to say that he had been at his garage ever since. But things just didn't add up. His pickup truck was parked out front and the engine was still warm. Sensing they had their man, the deputies arrested Dayton on suspicion of murder and secured the area for a thorough search. Physical evidence linking Dayton to the murder was plentiful. During Dayton's escape at the Denny's parking lot, he had dropped his knife. Forensic tests found human tissue and blood on the knife consistent with Jennifer's wounds, and Jennifer Smith's fingerprints were found inside Dayton's truck. With these pieces of evidence alone, the case against Dayton for Jennifer's murder was strong. But it was only the beginning. Inside the shop itself, investigators found a blood-stained hacksaw hanging prominently on the wall, and further scrutiny of the shop uncovered a wood-burning stove. It contained burnt fragments of women's clothing, bra clasps, metal buttons, and shoe components that Dayton attempted to incinerate. There were also bits of belt buckles and distinctive clothing studs, including star-shaped jean studs later identified as matching a pair of pants worn by a victim, Christine Adams. Detectives also found clumps of human hair scattered in his pickup truck, leading the police to believe that there were many more victims. They also found numerous bloodstains in the truck's passenger seat, footwell, and ceiling. The blood belonged to multiple people. At this initial stage, the police had no idea that they had a serial killer in their cells. There was no knowledge of the Malala forest burial sites. Police were unaware of the horrifying significance of these items, but they had recognized that they had likely uncovered a potential crime scene of staggering brutality, far more extensive than the single murder for which he had been arrested. During the initial interviews, Dayton denied any wrongdoing or just remained silent. However, the true extent of what he had done would soon come to light. Just days after the murder, on the 31st of August, a bow hunter stumbled upon a woman's remains on a privately owned forest near Malala. Suffice to say, the discovery triggered a massive search of the nearby area. Over the next few days, the police located 6 more bodies scattered throughout the woods. At that point, authorities had 7 unidentified female victims from one site. 6 of these victims were later positively identified, but not until the end of the investigation. The 7th, Tonya Marie Johnson, would remain a Jane Doe for decades to come. The crime scene painted a picture of methodical sadism. Forensic examination showed he had bound, stabbed, and in many cases, carved up the bodies after death. One victim was found with her abdomen grotesquely disemboweled with a deep, gashing slash that ran from below her breastbone down to her pubic area. One of her nipples had also been sliced off. Lisa Marie Mock had suffered deep stab wounds to her lower back, and most shockingly, both of her feet had been sawn off at the ankles. Investigators discovered Lisa's severed feet carefully placed beneath her corpse as if the killer had handled them with particular attention. The body of Reatha Giles displayed 6 stab wounds to her lower back, and one of her lower legs had been cut through with a saw, detaching her foot at the ankle. Christine Lotus Adams had a stab wound to the back, and her right foot was completely severed and was actually missing from the scene. Christine's wrists were still bound together by a leather dog collar when her remains were found, her arms tied above her head. The remains of Maureen Ann Hodges had been disturbed by scavenging animals. Her legs below the knee were never recovered. Even the last victim, 20-year-old Cynthia DeVore, whose body was mostly skeletal by the time of discovery, showed evidence of vicious stabbing in her upper back. The investigators noted just how the victims had extensive wounds to their private areas. The pattern of mutilation was not random in the slightest. Ultimately, each of these victims died alone in the woods, suffering extraordinary pain and terror in their final moments. The police knew straight away that the crimes were undertaken by a single perpetrator, and it just so happened that less than a month ago, the police had arrested a man for murder with evidence of other victims. Suspicion quickly focused on Dayton after the women all matched a similar profile to Jennifer. Sheriffs began cross-referencing evidence from the forest scene with the ongoing Dayton investigation. At the Malola Forest site, technicians collected dozens of items that seemed out of place in the wilderness. There were 38 empty miniature vodka bottles of the same brand, and 34 orange juice containers found littered around the victim recovery sites. Investigators recalled that Dayton had mentioned buying miniatures of vodka the night of Jennifer's murder. This clue gained significance as more was learned about Dayton's habits. Detectives confirmed from a nearby liquor store that Dayton often purchased 10 packs of vodka minis, the exact found in the forest. But even more damning were the tools and trace evidence linking Dayton's truck and workshop to the forest crimes. Forensic analysis later matched that hacksaw to distinctive cut marks found on the bones of multiple victims. The saw's blade width and the tooth pattern matched the marks found on the ankles of Lisa Mock and Christine Adams. But at this point, the police didn't know whose corpses they were. They combed through missing persons reports from summer of 1987 and started putting names to the forest remains. By mid-September of 1987, they were able to identify at least 4 of the victims through dental records. The police also began interviewing local street workers to see if any of these women had survived a terrifying encounter with a client matching Dayton's description. And indeed, a few women recounted close calls, including one woman named Heather. Thankfully, she was able to escape on her way to the forest. These survivors' accounts gave further insight into Dayton's methods and helped investigators firm up the case that one man was behind all of these attacks. By early 1988, the investigators had finally gathered enough evidence to charge Dayton with multiple counts of aggravated murder for the forest killings. The aggravating factor being that he committed intentional murder with deliberate cruelty. But prosecutors only had a solid case for Jennifer, so Jennifer's case was handled separately and first. The trial for the murder of Jennifer began in 1988, and the case drew media attention. During the trial, the prosecution methodically laid out the harrowing facts. Witnesses from the Denny's parking lot testified to the attack they saw that night. Sherry, the lady who saw the attack, later recounted hearing Jennifer's screams and finding her bleeding profusely on the pavement. But perhaps most damning, a state criminalist testified that a fingerprint on Dayton's truck belonged to Jennifer. Confronted with this overwhelming evidence, the jury deliberated only briefly. In 1988, Dayton Rogers was found guilty of aggravated murder in the death of Jennifer Lisa Smith. The case then moved to a penalty phase to determine his sentence. Under Oregon law at the time, a separate mini-trial was conducted to decide between execution or life imprisonment for an aggravated murder conviction. Without even knowing that Dayton was a suspected serial killer, the jury saw the parking lot murder as egregious enough for the maximum penalty. In 1988, they sentenced Dayton to death. It said that he showed absolutely zero remorse during the entire trial. Meanwhile, the county district attorney moved forward with the far larger case, charging Dayton with the murders of the women found in the forest. In early 1989, a grand jury indicted Dayton on multiple accounts of aggravated murder. The trial for the forest murders took place in 1989 and lasted several weeks, with graphic evidence and emotional testimony. Family members of the victims watched as prosecutors presented the forensic puzzle that tied Dayton to each woman. Survivors of Dayton's prior attacks in the 1970s also testified, giving jurors a chilling picture of a man who had been committing acts of extreme violence for years. The prosecution's case was airtight. The defense, facing daunting evidence, did not contest that Dayton killed these women. Their strategy instead was sparing Dayton's life by emphasizing his mental problems and his childhood. They hoped to garner some sympathy to spare his life. But this effort proved to be unsuccessful. In May of 1989, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts of the Forrest murders. At the penalty phase of his trial, the prosecutors recounted the full horror of how Dayton hogtied, carved up, and dumped these victims into the woods. The jurors hearing this were visibly shaken, and many needed some help after the trial was conducted. For a second time, the jury unanimously sentenced Dayton to death for the murders. With those verdicts, Dayton entered Oregon's death row in 1989. Justice was finally served. Well, almost. Unfortunately, the battle was far from over. Over the next 3 decades, Dayton's case became notorious for not only the gruesome crimes, but also for the series of appeals and overturned sentences that followed. The Oregon Supreme Court automatically reviewed his death sentence, and in 1992, they issued a landmark decision, vacating Dayton's initial death sentence from the Jennifer trial. As a result of this, Dayton was entitled to a new sentencing hearing. In 1994, at the retrial for his penalty, a second jury again heard the gruesome details, and once more, they decided on death. Yet again, in the year 2000, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned that death sentence due to some legal technicalities, but each time a sentence was vacated, Dayton had to be resentenced, forcing the victims' families to endure new hearings and to hear again in great detail what their family members suffered. A third penalty phase trial in 2006 resulted in Dayton being sentenced to death for the third time by a jury. And this too didn't stick. In 2012, the Oregon Supreme Court nullified the 2006 death sentence. These repeated legal do-overs were agonizing for the victims' loved ones. They saw Dayton continually escape final punishment on procedural grounds. Finally, in November of 2015, Dayton faced a 4th sentencing trial. It was nearly 28 years after his crimes had taken place. Once more, a jury heard the case for life in prison or death. The defense brought in a forensic psychologist who argued that at 62 years old and having spent decades in prison, Dayton now supposedly posed almost no risk of committing future violence if he was spared execution and placed in the general inmate population. The expert claimed that aging inmates as a whole become less dangerous over time. However, the prosecution was there to really drill home just how vicious and vile Dayton truly is, and how he took great pleasure from his victims' pain, terror, and mutilation. On the 16th of November 2015, the jury sentenced Dayton to death for the 4th time. In Oregon's history, no other convicted killer has been sent to death this many times. And guess what? This wasn't even the final chapter. In November of 2021, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned Dayton's death sentence once again. Oregon's legislature had narrowed down the legal definition of aggravated murder, effectively removing the death penalty option for murderers like Dayton. And before the county could conduct a 5th sentencing, Oregon's governor intervened. On the 13th of December 2022, Governor Kate Brown changed the sentences of all 17 people on Oregon's death row. This of course included Dayton. His sentence was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And with this, Dayton's decades-long journey through the court system effectively ended. Meanwhile, whilst all of this was going on, there was a major development. An unknown victim of the forest was finally identified through advanced DNA testing. She was identified as Tonya Marie Johnson, who was only 18 when Dayton took her life. This gave a name to the last Jane Doe and allowed her family to claim her remains at long last. As of today, Dayton is incarcerated for life, with absolutely zero chance of release. As of right now, he is in his early 70s, and Dayton is destined to die in prison. For the families of the women he killed, there is some comfort in knowing that Dayton will never walk free. However, many have expressed frustration that true justice was delayed for so long by the appeals process. As one prosecutor noted, the case of Dayton became a decades-long legal saga that truly tested the endurance of everyone involved. Since being incarcerated, Dayton did apologize for his crimes. He said, "The enormity of my crimes makes the word sorry all but inadequate. It would seem like an insult to even say it, but I still need to say it. Whether it's received or not, I am sorry. So very sorry."
This time, the intruder left a message spray-painted on one of the walls inside of the house. The message read, "The killer is back."
This case takes place in Seattle, Washington. At the time of the crimes taking place, James was a 36-year-old man who lived in the state of Washington. James didn't have an easy start in life. During his mother's pregnancy, she became ill with German measles. This illness is known to sometimes cause learning difficulties in children after birth. And then right after he was born in 1953, James caught spinal meningitis. The doctors didn't think he had much of a chance of survival, but miraculously, James managed to pull through. His mother looked after him and nursed him night and day for over 2 years. These illnesses resulted in James's cognitive abilities being affected, and his development growing up was slower than what is typical. James's parents had a turbulent relationship, and his father did not want to accept a son with learning difficulties. One day when James was 7, he had misbehaved, and so his father slapped him as hard as he could, and then just walked out on him and his mother, and never returned. James's mother did the best she could. She worked and studied hard, and became an accountant to support her family. James's father leaving would cause a great deal of anger to brew inside of him, and also caused him to have abandonment issues that would shape his behavior as he grew older. It was when James entered his teenage years that his behavior started to change. When James was younger, he was known to be rather cheeky and mischievous, but not in a bad way. As he approached his teenage years, he became more violent and would smash his mother's ornaments, plates, and windows. When James was around 12 years old, he managed to get hold of a live chicken. He then got hold of a blade and began to hack at the chicken. And then when he was 13, he entered his neighbor's home and set fire to the man's couch and curtains. James's behavior was obviously getting out of hand. The authorities decided to act, and his mother also wanted to get the help he needed. And so a judge sent him to Rainier School at Buckley. The school is a rehabilitation center for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The structure and the experience of the staff did wonders for James. They described him as a happy young man who thrived at the school. But then James was moved to a halfway house, and this change caused a lot of stress for him. At this halfway house, James began breaking windows almost every single night, and yet again started some fires. On a few occasions, James was arrested for his violent outbursts. When James turned 21, he was given the option to leave the halfway house, and he did. Despite his troubling behavior, James was released and left to fend for himself. For the next few years, James would either live in some residence or on the streets. He would also spend time with his mother and stay at her house for months at a time. But at his mother's house, James would become violent and angry. According to James, this was because his mother would nag him. He would trash her apartment and destroy her possessions and furniture. He would even leave her notes telling her that he wanted to kill her. Because of these outbursts, James's mother wanted to get him some help, and so he was evaluated by a mental health caseworker. But they said there were no real issues with James. Then, James's caseworker went to visit him in his flat. When they came over, they found James smearing feces all over the walls. The caseworker decided that he needed to be involuntarily supervised and evaluated for the following 2 weeks. But the court denied this request, despite the fact that they wrote in their report that James said he may kill someone one of these days. James was free to go. This cycle would repeat for years. James would stay with his mother or be on the streets, and his mother would continue to push for James to get the help he needed from the relevant authorities. And then James's sister passed away in February of 1990. After her passing, James became more withdrawn, and his mother noticed that he was speaking to himself more and becoming more violent. James would sometimes go to his sister's apartment and would lie on the couch talking to himself. One night, James was staying at his mother's home. She came home to find James watching a movie about the killer Lizzie Borden, a movie that he had watched multiple times. Lizzie Borden was an American woman accused and found not guilty of killing her father and stepmother in 1892. The full story is perhaps a tale for another day, but for a brief overview is that Lizzie allegedly stripped off naked, grabbed an axe, and used it to kill her father and stepmother. She was ultimately found not guilty, most likely due to the fact that many people didn't believe a woman was capable of such brutality. Many today believe that Lizzie was the one responsible for the killings, but she died a free woman. There is a skipping rope song that was dedicated to Lizzie, which goes as follows. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. James's mother saw that James was captivated and glued to the screen. She asked if it was okay to change the channel. James laughed and agreed. Later that night, while his mother slept, James looked through his mother's toolbox for a suitable weapon, eventually settling on a large knife. He then removed all of his clothing just like Lizzie did in the movie, and then slowly crept into his mother's room. He stood over the woman who had stood by him his whole life and supported him, and raised the knife. But then she awoke. She looked up to see James standing there naked with a grin on his face wielding the knife. His mother screamed and asked what he was doing. The screaming took James by surprise and he ran out of her room and out of the house. His mother barricaded herself in her room and waited until sunrise. The following morning, his mother called his mental health caseworker, who once again attempted to have him involuntarily supervised and evaluated for 2 weeks. James was kept in a facility until his hearing. The hearing concluded that James was not dangerous enough to be kept in a facility. They said he should be released to outpatient treatment for 90 days and given counseling and medication. He was also forbidden to contact his mother for the 90 days. Something she was totally against, as she wanted help for James, not for him to be further isolated. And so yet again, James was released. James never attended any of the counseling sessions, and on 2 occasions, he was arrested for pulling a knife on a woman and on a security guard. He was not able to actually harm them, but he did attempt to. Despite this, James was released again, and the failures of the system would soon be realized. James had been hearing voices in his head for some time, but the voices became too much, and during the night they would tell him to kill. On the 8th of March 1990, James walked through a neighborhood in Seattle at nighttime. He came across a house with some firewood and an axe outside. After playing with the axe, James entered the home and placed the axe inside the house and left. When the owners of the home woke up, they were confused to see the axe inside the home. Worried that somebody had entered their home, they called the police. The police came and they dusted the axe for palm and fingerprints to keep on file. A few nights later, James returned to the home to steal the axe. On the 13th of March, James decided he wanted to use the axe. The voices in his head were shouting at him, telling him to kill. As he was walking through the neighborhood of Queen Anne Hill, he came across an unlocked home. The home belonged to a 63-year-old woman by the name of Geneva MacDonald. Geneva was divorced and lived alone, and tragically, she had just forgotten to lock her door that day. James entered her home with the axe he had stolen. He had not picked this house out for any reason, it was totally random. He crept up her staircase and walked into her bedroom as she slept. James would later tell investigators that he became excited once Geneva turned around in her bed to see him standing there. He told the investigators, "I just said, 'Jesus Christ.' I got excited and took the axe over my head and went wham." James struck Geneva in the face with the axe multiple times. He then went and retrieved a pair of scissors from her drawers and also stabbed her repeatedly with the blade. After James had killed Geneva, he began to search through her cupboards and drawers, stealing whatever jewelry or money he could find. Rather than fleeing, James went into the kitchen to get himself some fruit. He then walked back upstairs to the guest bedroom and went to sleep. When the sun began to rise, he fled the scene. Geneva's friends had called her phone number the following day, but of course, they did not get a response. They went to check on her and were met with the gruesome scene. They called the emergency services immediately and the police soon arrived. They found Geneva dead in her bed with the murder weapons still in her room. The police realized it was the axe that had been stolen a couple of nights before. The search to find the killer began. James's fingerprints were on record from when he was younger, but the police were not able to find any fingerprints that were clear enough to figure out that he was the killer. As the police were looking to find the one responsible for the murder, James was living on the streets. He would sleep in parks or the woods during the day and stalk the streets at night. Due to the brutality and how James acted so calmly after the murder, the police were convinced the killer would strike again. And they were right. On the 17th of June, a man named Ian Warren was staying at his friend's house and sleeping on the sofa. They too had forgotten to lock the door. As Ian fell asleep, James entered the house, lurking in the shadows towards him, and began to attack. Ian immediately woke up as James tried to pin him down and stabbed at him repeatedly with the knife. Ian suffered 2 cuts to his hand, but thankfully, he was able to fight James off. James was not expecting such a resistance after killing Geneva so easily, and so he fled the scene. James's intention was not to hurt Ian, he wanted to kill him. A second attack struck fear into the community. Now everyone was making sure to lock their doors. On the 15th of July, James broke into another home. The owner of the home was awakened by the sound of someone downstairs. They simply assumed it was their housemate, but it wasn't. In a bid to spread some fear amongst the community, James was spray painting words on the wall of the house, which read, "The killer is back." James desperately wanted people to fear him. On the 21st of July, James was stalking the streets at 3 a.m. He looked through an open living room window and began to watch those inside. The people inside the apartment noticed James watching them, and one of them ran outside and chased him. The one who chased him was able to catch up and take a photograph. They then handed the image over to the police to aid in the investigation. The police were looking for the man, but with James sleeping during the day, this made it difficult. And then on the 21st of August, James broke into another home. He spray painted the walls with profanity and threats, hoping to further scare the citizens of Seattle. But James made a mistake. He had brought an axe with him and left it in the house he broke into. A fingerprint and palm print was found on the handle of the axe. The palm print matched with the palm print found on the axe that killed Geneva, and the fingerprint matched with an old fingerprint taken from when James had committed arson in his youth. They cross-referenced the fingerprints, and they now knew who committed the crimes. On the 13th of September, they positively identified the fingerprints as belonging to James, With the photograph and the fingerprints, they were certain they had found their killer. That very same day at 11:45 p.m, they found James in a local diner and he was arrested. As he was being put in the back of the police car, James said to the officers, "What took you so long?" James was brought in for questioning. He was asked about the crimes he committed, and James spoke about them with glee. He seemed excited to finally tell people about what he had done. He spoke about walking into Geneva's home and how he enjoyed killing her and seeing the blood come out of her face, even smiling as he describes what he did to her. During the interrogation, James also claimed that he was a victim himself and that people didn't treat him fairly and that his mother would nag him, which caused him to be angry at the world. He also spoke about the loud voices in his head telling him to kill every night. Despite the voices James claimed to hear, he was found competent to stand trial. During the trial, the interrogation footage was shown to the jury, in which James fully confessed to the murders. But during this trial, James said that his confession to the murders was not legitimate due to his mental illness. He also pleaded not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility. James would often smile during the trial, something the jury found to be disturbing and convinced them he knew exactly what he was doing. James's defense attorney claimed it was the state that was responsible for failing James and not giving him the proper treatment he needed, and that he too was a victim in this case. James was found guilty of the murder of Geneva. When the verdict was read out, James turned to one of his attorneys and asked, "Does this mean we lost?" He then started tugging at his hair and stared at the table in stress. The prosecutor was able to prove that James knew exactly what he was doing, and due to the threat James posed to society, he was sentenced to life in prison. To this day, James remains incarcerated at the Monroe Correctional Complex in Washington, with no possibility of parole.